Part 4. Chapter 31. April, 7 months earlier. Almost a month after the overdose, Roxanne came out of the coma. When she did, she opened her eyes as if she'd been startled awake. Eyeing her surroundings, she quickly realized she was alone in a hospital room. She went to sit up, but was trapped by these wires leading to all sorts of contraptions. What the hell's going on? A nurse walked into the room. "You're awake!" "What's going on?" Roxanne asked. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital. Do you know your name?" "Well, of course I know my name. It's Roxanne. Roxanne Simon." "Do you know what year it is?" "Look," Roxanne wasn't in the mood to play these silly games. "Why don't you just tell me what happened? What am I doing here?" "You had a little accident." "Oh, no." Roxanne moaned, thinking the nurse meant car wreck. "There's no need to worry," the nurse said. "I suppose you're all right now." "When can I get out of here?" "Your doctor will be the judge of that," she said. "But your family's going to be very happy that you're awake, especially your husband." Husband? That's a pretty sick joke, considering my husband is dead. Roxanne filled with repulsion. Not funny. Not funny at all. "On the contrary, Miss Simon, Frank Garrett is very much alive." Frank Garrett. Roxanne let the name rattle around in her head, but it meant nothing. When is the doctor going to be here?" Maybe then she could get some straight answers. "I'll call Dr. Sterling directly." The nurse left before Roxanne could make any further inquiries. Roxanne remained in her bed and looked around from one blank wall to the next. She wasn't asking for much. All she wanted to know was what was going on. It felt like ages before the door opened again. This time, a guy stormed in. Her doctor, she presumed. "Roxanne!" "In the flesh." She gave a little laugh. "Who are you?" "It's me. Jerry." He thought he'd see a spark of "hey, I'm glad to see you" in her expression. But there was nothing. She stared at him with vacant eyes. A bad feeling washed over Jerry. "Don't you know me?" "Should I?" "Yes, you should. I've been your doctor for 6 years. Roxanne shook her head. "I don't think so." "Roxanne," Jerry said cautiously, "do you know where you are?" "I'm in the hospital," she said, a bit frustrated. "But where?" "Tennessee?" she shrugged. "Which reminds me, when can I get out of here?" "Going somewhere?" he asked like a true shrink. "Yes, as a matter of fact, I am." Jerry didn't like the fact that she thought she was in Tennessee. He was also curious to know where was she in such a hurry to go. "Where are you going?" he asked casually. She looked at him suspiciously. "Candy and I are going on a trip." "How old are you?" he asked pointedly, more afraid of this answer than any of her previous ones. 19? That simple little word was such a bombshell. But he had to tell her the truth. "Roxanne, you've already taken that trip. You're not in Tennessee. You're in Florida." He waited a moment, to give her time to let that sink in. Then he continued. "You're not 19. You're 27. Roxanne stared at him like he was crazy. "Who'd you say you were?" "I'm Dr. Jerry Sterling." "Are you sure you didn't escape from the mental ward?" she asked half seriously. "You really don't have any idea who I am, do you?" "I don't know you," she said firmly. "What's the last thing you remember?" "I told you that already." She sucked in a breath and held it for a moment. "Candy and I are going on a trip." "I know this is a very hard thing for you to comprehend," he said. "But like I've already told you, you're in Florida. You're 27 years old. You have a very lucrative career as a best-selling author, and you're an award-winning actress." He stopped to catch his breath. How much was too much information at this point? But Jerry had to set her straight. He had to bring her back to 1989. You're married to a rock star, Frank Garrett, and the two of you have a 5-year-old son named Frankie. He wrapped up the past 8 years in a nutshell. She found the notion that she could be a writer or an actress, much less best-selling or award-winning, absolutely ludicrous. She was no actress. She knew that. Sure, she liked to write, but she was too afraid of rejection to consider letting anyone look at her work. And married to a rock star? That was an even bigger one to swallow, right along with the notion that she had a kid. It wasn't a real big secret, and everybody knew it. Roxanne Simon was not the motherly type. "I don't buy it," she finally said. "There's more." "Really?" She laughed, feeling vulnerable. "Do you want me to tell you why you're here in the hospital?" "Oh, enlighten me, please," she remarked a bit snidely, and regretted it as soon as the words left her mouth. "You tried to kill yourself." He sounded serious, and that bothered her. "You plotted and planned your demise in great detail for months." "I have just one question for you." Roxanne paused long enough to make sure she had his attention. "If this is all true like you say, and my life was so great—" She didn't buy the bill of goods this doctor was trying to sell. "Then why on earth would I try to kill myself?" "Your life is very complicated. It hasn't been as easy as it sounds." "Supposing that I'm willing to give your little story the benefit of the doubt, can you prove any of it?" "Well, I could bring in the books you've written. I could bring in the movies you starred in. I could even bring you a videotape of your wedding, as well as your marriage license. I could bring you pictures of your son and his birth certificate." "Stop it!" Roxanne had heard enough. None of this stuff sounded right. "Then why don't I remember any of it?" He sighed deeply before answering. "Your relationship with Frank Garrett has been less than successful. I theorize that your mind has decided to block out all existence of him. Unfortunately, the only way to do that is wipe out your entire memory of the time you've known him." Jerry shook his head. The truth wasn't pretty. "Regrettably, everything else gets wiped out too." "If I hated him that much," she questioned no one in particular, "then why in the hell did I marry him in the first place?" "I don't think it was a case of hate at all," he gave his opinion. "But I think your love for Frank Garrett was overshadowed by the thought of losing him. And it tore you apart." The thought that maybe the doctor was telling the truth crossed Roxanne's mind. If that were the case, then she had a 5-year-old son out there somewhere. A son she couldn't remember. And God knows she never wanted to be anybody's mother. Not that she could remember. Chuck's mother used to say Roxanne didn't really love Chuck because she refused to have his children. She thought she'd love Chuck, but still having a kid was the last thing she wanted. But now, here this guy was, telling her she did have a child. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" she asked softly, unable to hide the anxiety seeping out in her voice. Roxanne got up and took slow, careful steps toward the bathroom. Once inside, she closed the door. If it turned out to be true, if she had given birth, then the evidence should be there on her stomach. Slowly, she lifted her hospital gown, afraid of what she might find. Looking down at her tummy, she saw faint stretch marks. She released the gown and it fell back down over her knees. Roxanne's gaze traveled up the wall. A mirror entered her peripheral vision. She turned toward it and stared at herself. While her face wasn't marked with any telltale lines, clearly she was much more mature than she remembered. Suddenly, Roxanne was afraid of what she'd become, professionally and mentally. She also feared the thought of a husband she couldn't remember. It sounded like he might have had a little too much control over her. After all, according to the doc outside, she'd tried to kill herself because of him. But the thing that bothered her most of all was the fact that she was supposed to be somebody's mother. And because she couldn't remember ever wanting to be a mother, she didn't think she had what it took. Otherwise, she would never have pulled a stunt like this, with no forethought whatsoever regarding the consequences of leaving a child motherless. She obviously hadn't thought about that, Because if she had, she never would have done something so cold and cruel, so heartless. What have I done? Roxanne went back out into the room and sat down on the edge of the bed. What about Candy? Where is she?
She's in Tampa, he said. And she's very worried about you.
But how is she? Roxanne wanted more. What's become of her life?
Well, like you, she's an award-winning actress.
That news pleased Roxanne. She smiled. She could easily believe Candy was a successful actress. Yep, she could definitely see that. Is she married? Does she have a family?
Well, no, but she is very close to your husband's partner.
Roxanne told herself that surely Candy must be happy.
Well, I suppose we should give them a call, Jerry said. They're all going to be very happy to learn that you're awake. And Frank is going to be very eager to see you.
That thought scared her half to death. No, she objected quickly. I can't see them.
You don't want to see your family? He asked, letting his confusion shine through.
You don't understand, she said. I don't remember them. I can't see them. I wouldn't know what to say or do.
Okay. Jerry didn't want her getting too upset over this. If you can't face seeing them right now, that's okay.
You have to promise me that I won't have to see them. She looked like a frightened child.
Don't worry. You won't have to face anybody until you're ready.
Jerry did contact Jason, and they both decided that humoring Roxanne would be the best course of action, at least for the time being. They also knew that if Frank Garrett had the slightest inkling Roxanne was awake, nothing or no one could keep him away. With a bit of reluctance, they decided to let everyone continue to think she was still in the coma. Everyone, including Candy. But to pull that one off, they had to keep all of them away from Roxanne. That's when Jason came up with the idea of a legal document to fix the problem. They paid the hospital dearly to carry on as if Roxanne was still there and in a coma. Meanwhile, Jason and Jerry got Roxanne out of the country, where she was less likely to be recognized. If the news of her recovery got out, Frank would be more overbearing than ever. The bottom line was that Roxanne just wasn't ready for Frank Garrett. Chapter 32. 7 months later. Kirk followed Roxanne as she headed for the house directly behind them. Leaving the beach, she punched in a security code and passed through a gate leading into someone's lush private digs. Kirk couldn't help but eye the Olympic-sized swimming pool as they passed it by, thinking it was a bit of a waste since the beach was steps away. I'm sorry I don't remember you, she said. You said we were in a movie together?
Yes.
Kirk followed her toward the house. You're first. Even though she'd been told about the past 8 years in great detail, over and over again, she still had a hard time keeping it all together and inside her head. Her brain had shut out the information, and it seemed determined not to take any of it back in again. I've got the movies on video, she said, but I haven't worked up the nerve to watch them yet. She almost laughed at herself. I get that. I have trouble watching footage of myself, too. Kirk cleared his throat. Roxanne, how is it that you came to be here? Slowly, he came to the realization that she had some form of amnesia. Yet at the same time, he was totally confused. She opened the slider and stepped inside the house. I think Jason and Jerry can explain that better than me. Jason and Jerry, of course. He'd forgotten all about them. Kirk! Jason and Jerry blurted his name in unison. You! Kirk belted out. What the hell are you two doing here? Finally, reality smacked him in the face. This is my home, Jason said as if he owed Kirk nothing. I want to know what's going on, Kirk insisted. And I want to know now. All right, Kirk, Jerry said. You want to know what's going on? Have a seat. It's a long story. I've got all the time in the world. Kirk sat down on the couch. Roxanne sat down on the sofa too, but not directly beside him.
Roxanne woke up from the coma with a rare form of partial amnesia, Jerry explained. She's blocked out 8 years of her life, dating back to shortly before she met Frank Garrett. She doesn't remember anything that happened during this time or anyone she met, including Frankie.
Why are you hiding her recovery from everyone? Kirk was trying desperately to understand.
Roxanne was scared, Jerry said simply. She doesn't remember anybody but Candy, and she only remembers her as a 19-year-old girl, not a 27-year-old woman. She has no recollection of anyone else that she's met during the last 8 years, not even me or Jason.
He paused, wondering how he was going to explain this to Candy and Frank.
She doesn't understand why she did what she did, and she can't bear the thought of having to justify her actions to a family she can't remember.
But you had no right. Kirk's voice trailed off in a quarrelsome tone. You could have let them know she was okay.
And knowing that Roxanne was awake, Jerry supposed, just how long do you think Frank would have stayed away?
He went silent briefly.
I'll tell you, not very long. Not very long at all. There'd be no place on this earth she could hide.
They did it because I asked them to, Roxanne said. If anybody's to blame here, it's me.
Roxanne's welfare is the most important factor in all of this, Jerry said. More than Frank or anybody else's needs, for that matter.
You let me believe she was lying helplessly in a coma, Kirk said solemnly. You let her family think that too. You let her son think that.
Under the circumstances, I think it's probably best for Frankie this way, too.
Jerry gave his opinion. Don't tell me about Frankie, Kirk said. I was there when he was born. Where were you? You were there? Roxanne asked.
Remember? Jerry quickly focused on her. You and Frank were apart when you had Frankie.
Oh, yeah, she said vaguely and then turned to Kirk. You and I must have been really good friends then.
We were, Kirk said. We are. Tell her the truth, Kirk, Jerry insisted.
The truth? Roxanne's tone matched the puzzling expression overtaking her face. The truth is, Kirk said reluctantly, I was in love with you. And did I love you back? She asked, curious. The reality of Roxanne's amnesia set in, and Kirk realized if she couldn't remember Frank Garrett, then she couldn't possibly be in love with him. Suddenly, Kirk had hope. You and I shared something really special, he said, twisting reality to suit his needs. Unfortunately, it was overshadowed by the fact that your son belongs to Frank Garrett. Kirk had found a grand opportunity to make her believe she'd loved him instead of Frank.
Kirk! Jason stomped on his plan. Aside from the fact that this whole thing is really none of your business, but you've chosen to stick your nose in where it does not belong, you will tell her the truth. The way it really happened.
Kirk hesitated, striving to gain control over his mounting resentment toward Jason Fisher. He sucked in a breath and turned to Roxanne. No, he said with little enthusiasm. You did not love me. You tried. But you could never love anybody but him. Jason blew out his frustration. Even though neither he nor Jerry thought Frank was the best thing for Roxanne, the last thing they needed or wanted was Kirk Bronson coming in and misleading her into believing something that was totally untrue. Roxanne was already confused enough. Kirk, Roxanne said, would you come back down to the beach with me? Sure. Kirk nodded. Because whether Jason or Jerry liked it or not, he wasn't about to give up hope that he could win Roxanne over this time. The way he saw it, he had the advantage now because she didn't remember Frank Garrett. Roxanne turned to Jason and Jerry. I think that if I can just maybe talk to Kirk, she said hopefully. Maybe he can tell me something that might remind me of those lost years.
Well, I guess it couldn't hurt.
Jerry shrugged, but he knew Roxanne was grasping at straws. After all this time, it wasn't likely that she'd ever recover her memory. Jerry had told her as much many times.
I just don't want you getting your hopes up over something that's not likely to happen. Remember? Recovery after all this time only happens in the movies.
Still, she went with Kirk back down to the beach.
What are we going to do now?
Jason asked after they'd left.
We're going to tell her that her time has run out, Jerry said. It had to happen sooner or later. One thing's for sure. If Frank goes to the hospital and raises enough hell, he's going to find out she's not there. And when that happens, we can give her until Sunday.
Jason made the decision on the spur of the moment. Come Monday, she's going to have to face them all, whether she likes it or not.
Oh, what a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive.
Jerry quoted Sir Walter Scott. My friend, Jason shook his head. We didn't just weave the web. We're all caught up in it. Can I ask you a question? Roxanne asked Kirk as they walked across the sand and back toward her blanket. Sure, Kirk said. Do you think I was crazy? She couldn't look at him. When you knew me back then? Well, he said hesitantly, if I told you there was nothing wrong with you back then, I'd be lying. Tell me the truth, she requested. Did he dominate my thoughts and my life, even when we were apart? Kirk thought about what Roxanne had been like back then. The way she never really knew where she was at times. The way she always thought Frank was somewhere nearby, waiting to have lunch with her or something. And when she was in touch with reality, she was always worried that Frank was going to find her and punish her.
Not that I am an expert or anything, Kirk finally said.
But I suppose he did. Do you have any idea why I did this to myself? No. He assumed she was talking about the rumored attempted suicide. You're going to have to face them, sooner or later. I'm afraid to. Why? Because I don't know them, she confessed. And considering what I've heard about this Frank Garrett, I don't think I want to know him either. She paused with a heavy sigh. And as for my son, the thing is, I don't remember ever wanting to be a mother. Maybe he's better off without me.
What about Candy?
Kirk asked. You remember her? Why don't you want to see her? Well, aside from the fact that I'm thoroughly ashamed of myself, I would love to see Candy. But if I see her, then I'll have to see the rest of them.
They're worried about you, Kirk said. It's not right to let them think you're still in a coma. And facing them won't be as bad as you think.
That's easy for you to say. She rolled her eyes.
You faced me.
That's different.
Why? He questioned her with a slight smile. Because you don't owe me any explanations.
I know I should see them. But every time I think about it, I get so scared. A chill rushed over Roxanne. She shivered.
Well, I guess you don't have to see them if you really don't want to, he said. But just let them know you're okay.
I promise to let them know I'm okay, she said in a bargaining way. Would you promise to not lecture me about it anymore? And give me at least a few days to prepare myself for this?
Deal.
Roxanne looked at Kirk, overwhelmed with feelings of admiration. You will stay with me, won't you?
I'll stay with you as long as you want me to.
As confused as Roxanne was about those lost years, she thought she saw something in Kirk. Something she'd never seen before. All the while losing sight of the fact that there must be a reason why she'd never fell in love with him in the first place. Roxanne never considered for a second that Frank Garrett might be that reason. He was no longer of importance to her. After all, she couldn't remember him. Jason and Jerry were at their wits' end trying to figure out how to tell Roxanne that her time had run out because Frank was intent upon seeing her. As the weekend passed, they realized Roxanne wasn't the only one running out of time. They too were in the same predicament. Whether they looked forward to it or not, they had to tell her. But like a gift from the heavens, she brought up the subject first. Finding Jason in his library, Roxanne paused in the doorway. Are you busy? No. He backed away from his desk. Come on in. I wanted to talk to you about Candy. And the others, she added, feeling a little uncomfortable talking about people she had no memory of. I've been meaning to talk to you about them, too. I'm sorry, but we're going to have to tell them, he said reluctantly. It seems your son has been having dreams about you. He insists that you aren't in the hospital. He claims that you're at the beach. He gave her time to let that sink in. Frank is determined to show him differently. An anxious feeling swept through Roxanne. My son has been dreaming that I'm at the beach? Yes, Jason answered. That's very odd. Frankie's very attached to you, Jason told her. I know how you feel right now, but you and Frankie have a very special bond, and he misses you very much. Roxanne couldn't remember the slightest thing about Frankie, but still, she felt guilty for depriving him of his mother. I need to see him, she finally said. Hell, I'll probably spend the rest of my life never remembering a damn thing about the last 8 years, she added compliantly. But that doesn't change the fact that I do have a son out there. And I guess it's time for me to accept my grown-up responsibility. Jason blew his relief out in a sigh. I'll get us a flight out tomorrow. I'm not so sure I like that idea, she grumbled. I was thinking more along the lines of them coming here. If you're more comfortable with that, Jason said. I don't mind. I know I have to go back to my son. She hesitated. But I'm not so sure I want to go back to the marriage. The thought chafed her like a bad sunburn. I'll tell you something, Roxanne. Jason's tone turned serious. While it's true that I've never been a big fan of Frank Garrett's, you need to consider the facts. During 5 years of separation, you were never able to get over him. You didn't move forward because you couldn't. You should give a lot of time to a lot of thought before you make any decisions regarding your marriage. I'll keep that in mind. But no matter what the past had been, the truth of the matter was that now Roxanne had no memories or recollections of Frank Garrett, husband or not. At present, she had no feelings toward him whatsoever, one way or another. Neither Jason nor Jerry looked forward to facing Frank or Candy. But they'd started this thing together, and it was only fitting that they finish it that way too. Patiently they stood at the door of Roxanne's home, waiting for Jameson to answer the bell. Promptly, the butler opened the door and smiled pleasantly when he saw them. After his short, formal greeting, he moved aside, letting them in. Ever since Jason's telephone call, Frank had been pacing the living room. He had a terrible feeling that something wasn't quite right. Jason had said to get Candy and Rich over because he and Jerry would be at the house within half an hour. The possibilities of why they were being called together invaded Frank's comfort zone, threatening his well-being. Jason and Jerry entered the living room. Neither of them took seats. That made Frank nervous. Frank, Jason spoke first. It was always a bad sign when that fruitcake Jerry let anybody else do the talking. Maybe you should sit down. Frank stuck his finger in Jason's face. Don't you tell me she's dead. Do you hear me? Fear and doubt raged inside Frank, but mostly fear. Don't you dare tell me that. On the contrary, Jerry said. Roxanne is very much alive, and she's out of the coma. She is? Hope chased Frank's fear away. Thank God. For a brief moment, Candy closed her eyes. But there is a problem, Jerry said. How can there be a problem? Frank said dismissively. She's awake. She's okay. That's all that matters. Well, she's not really okay. Reluctance lit Jerry's face. What do you mean she's not okay? Frank's fear threatened to turn around on his hope. Roxanne is suffering from a rare form of partial amnesia, Jerry explained. She's basically lost the last 8 years. What? Frank didn't fully understand what that meant. She doesn't remember you, Frank. Jerry sounded happy to tell Frank that bit of news.
She doesn't remember her career. She doesn't remember her son.
But he didn't seem to like delivering the last two pieces at all. What are you saying? Candy asked nervously.
The only familiar thing about the life Roxanne has now is you, Candy.
Jerry gave her a slight, remorseful nod.
But she doesn't remember you as you are now. Her memory of you is that of a 19-year-old girl.
How can that be? Candy didn't hide her confusion.
Well, I can only theorize.
Jerry turned to look at Frank.
The last few months before she overdosed took such a toll on her mental instability that she just wanted out.
He paused, making no attempt to hide his condemnation of Frank.
When that didn't happen, her brain took over. Seems it's decided to wipe out the memory and existence of what troubled her so.
That much was true, and Frank knew it. She was so disgusted with him. Rather than coming back home to the same old scene, she chose to block him out entirely. Unfortunately, that also meant she'd blocked out Frankie. Silently, Frank ridiculed himself for that. I'm going to see her, Frank decided at that precise instant. I'll tell her how much I love her and she'll remember. She'll remember me and she'll remember Frankie and everything will be fine. Frank spun around, but before he was 2 steps toward the door, Jason had grabbed his arm.
You'd better hear what I have to say first.
Who cares what you have to say? Frank gave a dismissive shrug. You will, Jason said, once you've heard it. Make it quick, will you? I've got to get to Roxy. Roxanne has a problem with the fact that she tried to kill herself, Jason said. She's also having trouble with the notion that she has a family she can't remember. And why, I don't know. But she's convinced herself she's incapable of being a good mother. Well, I can understand that she's scared, since she can't remember us, Frank said. But I'll fix it. I'll fix everything.
Just like you fixed it when you married her?
Jerry's snide tone bit at Frank. He paused to collect himself after that blow. While the supposition was true, Frank didn't deserve it as much as he thought he did. Well, this Frank didn't. The Frank standing before them right now was not the same man who plotted, planned, and acted to drive Roxanne over the edge. The man standing before them now wanted nothing more than to prove himself to his wife. He only wanted to win her back, and he really had his work cut out for him. Are you through? Frank asked Jason, ignoring Jerry. No, I'm not, Jason said. Roxanne is not in the hospital. She's at my beach house in Jamaica. Beach house? She's at the beach? Oh, no, Frank said aloud. Had Frankie been right all along? Just how long has she been at your beach house? Jason sighed heavily. About 7 months. Frankie knew. Frank closed his eyes, and I didn't listen. But Frank didn't have time to beat himself up over that. Right now he had to deal with the 2 men standing before him. They'd let the whole family believe the worst of Roxanne's condition. Never mind him and Candy. They'd put a child through holy hell. The old Frank would have seen to it that they paid for that. But the new Frank had more important things to consider. He opened his eyes and tossed a hard glare at Jason and Jerry. After what you've put my son through these past few months, it wouldn't take any effort from me at all to kill you both. He shook his head and collected his anger. There's only one thing that's stopping me. You know where she is, but you're going to take me to her. Yes, we are, Jason nodded, but only because she's ready to see you now. Wait a minute, Candy shouted. Jason, how could you do this to me? How could you, of all people, lie to me? Candy, it wasn't something I took great pleasure in doing, he assured her. But you did. You let me think my sister was lying somewhere helplessly in a coma. You let me think that for months. Her tone stayed calm, but contempt carried her words. I'll never forgive you for that. Candy, I truly am sorry. His apology didn't carry much weight with Candy. She'd been betrayed by both Jason and Jerry. She vowed never to forgive either of them as long as she lived. Roxanne had told herself that even though Candy and the others were on an airplane right now headed for Jamaica, that eventually, maybe after she'd eaten, she'd calm down. That didn't happen. She began pacing the length of the patio. It wouldn't be long now. What was she going to say to them? How could she possibly explain herself? "Just try to remember," Kirk said. "They all care about you." "I keep trying to tell myself that." She laughed nervously. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. "Before they arrive?" "No." She shook her head. "You can't leave." "All right. I'll stay with you if that's what you want." Kirk was the only comforting thing she had to hold on to from a totally foreign past. She told herself she couldn't face any of them without Kirk to fall back on. She hadn't considered how Frank might react when he found out Kirk Bronson was there too. Chapter 33. The library was Roxanne's favorite room in Jason's house, maybe because of all the books. Thousands of them lined the walls, and she felt she could somehow identify with each and every one. It wasn't hard to make the decision to wait for Candy in the room that brought her so much comfort. Anxiety rippled through Roxanne as Candy came in and closed the door. They looked at each other, and Roxanne studied Candy's face intently. After a brief moment of hesitation, Candy rushed toward her. "Rocky," she embraced her. "Thank God you're okay." "Candy." Roxanne's voice was weaker than she'd anticipated. "I'm sorry," she said. "I really am." Candy backed up a couple of steps and dragged her hair out of her face. "You can't remember anything?" Roxanne shook her head. "No." She really wanted to change the subject. "How are you, though?" "I'm good," Candy smiled. "Rich and I got married." A look came over her that said she'd realized, a little too late, that the info probably wouldn't mean much to Roxanne. "Are you happy?" Roxanne asked, because that was, after all that mattered. "Yes," she nodded. "We are." "Is he worthy of my sister?" "You'd be really happy about it, if you could remember him." Speaking of husbands, cautiously, Roxanne brought up the subject of hers. "You want me to tell you about Frank?" Candy asked knowingly. Roxanne nodded. "Did I love him?" "Yes. More than you knew how to deal with." "And did he love me?" Candy's reply came quickly and definitely. "Frank loves you more than anything in this world." "Then..." Roxanne chose her words carefully. "Why did I try to kill myself?" "Well, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that your relationship with Frank was picture perfect. It wasn't. There were misunderstandings between you two, and things got really complicated. But I think you should probably get these answers from Frank." "I'm afraid of him." "Afraid of Frank?" Candy flashed her a puzzled look. "Why?" "Well, something about him made me crazy." She voiced her fears. "What if it happens again?" "It won't happen again," Candy said. "You sound so sure of that." "I am." Candy paused, thinking. "Can I ask you a question, though?" "Sure." "Why didn't you at least let me know you were awake?" "It wouldn't have been right for me to put you in that position." "Why?" Candy seemed to be struggling with that notion. "I would have kept your secret." "I know you would have. And that wouldn't have been fair to you and your loyalty to Rich, or Frank, for that matter." Roxanne pushed aside her anxiety. "From what I understand, I've already put you in that position too many times in the past, and I'm sorry I did that to you." "I did what I did." Candy accepted full responsibility for her actions. "I did what I had to do." "I'm sorry if I've hurt you." Candy wasn't going to spend too much time fretting over things that had already happened. Instead, she preferred to seek out a way to bring Roxanne's memory back. What's the last thing you remember? The last thing I remember is that you and I were getting ready to leave Tennessee to start a new life somewhere else.
You don't recall the trip to Florida?
I don't remember leaving Tennessee, Roxanne said. I only remember preparing to leave.
Well, I will tell you this much about Frank Garrett, Candy said. The first night we were in Tampa, we went to this club called The Other Place. You met Frank that night. And to be honest with you, you two were smitten with each other from the very beginning.
Roxanne tried to imagine what it might feel like to be so infatuated with someone. Sure, she'd loved Chuck, but keeping their hands off one another had never been an issue for Roxanne and her first husband. I wish I could remember, Roxanne said. But Jerry says too much time has gone by. He says it's not likely that I'll ever regain the memories I've lost.
Then make new ones, Candy suggested simply.
And you can start now.
'Cause if I know Frank, he's probably out there having a hissy fit right about now.
She laughed softly.
Are you ready to see him?
Well, I guess I'm about as ready as I'll ever be, Roxanne said with little enthusiasm. Frank had been pacing the living room ever since Candy had disappeared into the library. He was tired of waiting for his turn.
What the hell are they doing in there? Is Candy giving her a play-by-play account of the past 8 years, or what?
He spat his frustrations out at no one in particular.
I'm her husband. I'm the one who should be in there with her.
Keep your shorts on, Frank. Candy came in. She's ready to see you now. He looked at Candy, already regretting his outburst.
I'm sorry.
Don't give it a second thought. Candy latched onto his arm and led him into the hallway. Frank, if you want to keep Roxanne, she advised. If I were you, I'd tell her the truth when she asks you for it.
And believe me, she will ask.
Okay, he said somberly. And just remember one thing.
What's that?
She doesn't remember you. That notion scared Frank.
Candy, he said with uncertainty. If she doesn't remember me, then she doesn't love me anymore, does she?
But if she loved you once, Frank, Candy said, she can love you again. Frank tapped on the library door, waited a couple of seconds, and then opened it. Seeing Roxanne standing on the other side of the room with her back to him, she was looking out the window. He sighed, relieved. He stood in the doorway for a second and thanked his lucky stars because he'd been so afraid she would never wake up. Finally, he moved halfway across the room and stopped, leaning against the edge of the desk. She made no attempt to move or turn around to acknowledge his presence. Did she hear him come in? Frank cleared his throat. Roxanne was well aware that he was there. She was afraid to turn around to look at him, terrified that with one look she might revert back to her old self again. But she had to look at him sooner or later. She really didn't have a choice. When she finally did turn around, she saw a smile cross his face. While she couldn't explain it, she felt comforted by his presence. She felt an uncertain familiarity about him, too. She could almost swear she knew him from somewhere, but she just couldn't place him. Even so, she felt an overwhelming need to go to him. She didn't understand that at all because she couldn't recall a single memory of him. That was basically it in a nutshell. She didn't know this guy. Sure, they all said he was her husband, but she definitely had to take their word for that one. The only thing she could be truly certain of was that he'd driven her to the point of suicide. Her better judgment told her she couldn't afford to let that happen again. Next time she might succeed. Finally, Roxanne pushed herself to walk toward him.
Tell me that you know me,
he said in a pleading way. She propped herself beside him on the desk. I wish I could. She studied his face. But no. She shook her head. I don't.
So how are you otherwise? He turned his concern to her welfare. Your physical health is not in danger, is it? He added, clearly needing reassurance.
I'm okay. A wave of reticence brushed through her at the thought of someone being so concerned about her well-being. "I want you to come home, Roxy," he said. "You belong with me and Frankie." His words were more of a plea than anything else. He was not the demanding Frank she'd heard so much about. She looked into his eyes, sensing the guilt and pain he'd burdened himself with. Instantly, she got the feeling she shouldn't be able to see his eyes. She peered at him with a scrutinizing look. "What's wrong?" he asked uneasily, picking up on her anxiety. "Why do I feel like I shouldn't be able to see your eyes?" "Shouldn't see my eyes?" He repeated her words, searching his mind for a reason. Then he remembered his shades. "My sunglasses. I used to wear them all the time. You could never see my eyes, and that always bothered you." Her expression didn't change, but he got the feeling she'd accepted his explanation. She sucked in a breath and asked, "Do you know why I did this to myself?" "Yes," he nodded. "You did it because of me. I drove you to it. But I swear to you, I never wanted this to happen." "I want you to tell me the truth about us. Don't hold anything back." "All right," he said. "But first you have to promise me that you'll believe me when I say I don't feel that way anymore." "If you really mean it, then I'll believe it." "When you disappeared without a word, I didn't know what to think," he said. "And while it's true we weren't exactly happy with one another at that point, but I loved you. I looked for you, but I couldn't find you. And Candy wasn't any help either." Frank's frustration escaped in his voice. "You surfaced through the press about a year later, and then I heard you'd had a baby, and Kirk Bronson had publicly claimed to be the father. You didn't deny it, so I figured it must be true. I thought you were having an affair with him behind my back and that you'd left me for him." He paused, trying to cover the hurt he was still feeling over the lie. "I spent more than 4 years believing my son belonged to another man. A man you'd walked out on me for. No hi, bye, kiss my ass or nothing. And I hated you for that. I hated you for Kirk Bronson. And when I found out the truth, I hated you for that too," he said. "I spent 5 long years thinking you'd betrayed me. And when I found out differently, I felt even more betrayed. I wanted to punish you. I wanted to make you pay for what you'd done to me." His jaw tightened. He wasn't comfortable with the words he was saying now. "And when I found out about your mental instability, I decided to use it in my favor. I had no idea how serious it really was. I just figured I could use it as a means to get custody of Frankie. I wanted to take him away from you, just like you'd taken him from me." Frank wondered if exposing the whole truth would take Roxanne too far out of his reach. "But I swear to you, I never wanted this to happen. In fact, after about 6 months of being married to you and trying to punish you, I finally realized I was wrong." He wanted her to know he was trying to apologize to her that night she'd taken the overdose. "I finally accepted the fact that I could never hate you more than I love you. That night, I was coming home to tell you how sorry I was, and that I just wanted us to put the past behind us and try to be happy with each other again, like we were in the beginning." Frank laughed at himself. "But as usual, I'm always a day late and $1 short." "I was a terrible person." Her tone and her expression were dripping with disdain. "I don't understand how I could have put any of you through the things I did. And I'm thoroughly ashamed of myself." She moved away from him, back to the window where she stared outside. "That's why I haven't had the nerve to face any of you. Especially you." "It wasn't your fault," he told her. "I'm the one to blame." "How could you love someone like me?" From what Roxanne was hearing, she didn't deserve his love or his loyalty. Frank pushed himself off the desk and went to her side. "It's not a hard thing to do," He smiled softly and touched her cheek. Chills rushed through her. Even though she couldn't remember a single thing about him, she felt herself growing weak against his touch. She wasn't overlooking the fact that he might be telling the truth when he said he didn't feel hatred toward her anymore. Still, she was afraid of him and what he could do. Apparently, he had the power to drive her over the edge. If it had happened once, who's to say it wouldn't happen again? "I've got to tell you, Frankie." She wanted to let him know Kirk was there. "What'd you call me?" Frank asked quickly. "I don't know. Frankie? Is that wrong?" Her tone grew agitated. I'm sorry." "No, it's not wrong. It's exactly right," he said, happier now. "You always called me Frankie. In fact, you're the only one who ever did." "I did?" She wished she could remember something. Anything about this familiar stranger. "Listen, we have all the time in the world for me to tell you about us," he said. "But right now, there's a little boy out there who really needs to see his mother." Fear swept over Roxanne. "Would you come with me?" "Of course I will." He smiled, took her by the hand, and led her out to the terrace. Outside, she saw a little boy sitting on the ground with his back to them. He was playing with something. Cars, maybe. He looked like he was about 5 or 6. "Hey, Frankie," Frank called to him. "Look who's here." Frankie turned around, and his eyes lit up when he saw Roxanne. "Mommy!" He jumped up, flew into her arms, and immediately started crying. Roxanne held on to him, trying to bring him comfort. "Sweetie, don't cry." She was filled with remorse at the sound of his tears. "It's okay. Mommy's here now. Mommy's here, and I'll never leave you again." Frankie didn't say anything. He just held on to her as tightly as his little arms would allow. He tried to hold back the tears, which resulted in little whimpers every now and then. Roxanne took Frankie and sat down in a nearby chair. She swayed back and forth, as if to rock him to sleep, and kissed the top of his head while caressing his back soothingly. She didn't say anything. She just sat there for the longest time, holding him securely in her arms. How could she ever have forgotten him? Silent tears fell from her eyes. Roxanne got wrapped up in her son and his pain, and forgot about telling Frank that Kirk was in the house. Frank sat silently on the couch in the living room, letting reality sink in. He would have preferred that Roxanne remembered him as soon as she saw him, but that didn't happen. Still, he was happy to find her in good health, aside from the loss of memory. "Hey, Frank." Rich walked into the room. "How'd it go? Is she okay?" "She's fine," Frank said dismally. "Physically, anyway. But she doesn't remember me." "Well, look at it like this." Rich sat down on the couch. "That just means she doesn't remember any of the bad stuff either." "I'm telling her about it," Frank said. "I'm not hiding anything from her." Being told about it and remembering it are two entirely different things. Jerry had summoned Roxanne into the library. He was worried about her. He wanted to be sure she hadn't been subjected to too much emotional distress. "How are you holding up?" he asked casually. "I'm okay," she said truthfully. "It hasn't been nearly as bad as I thought it would be." "How do you feel about Frank now that you've met him again?" "Well, it's kind of weird." She was hardly able to believe that she could tell anybody these things, much less Jerry. "You know that feeling of excitement you get when you meet someone you're really attracted to?" "And where exactly does Kirk fit into all of this?" Jerry asked, like a true shrink. "Kirk!" she gasped. She'd forgotten all about him. "I've got to tell Frank that he's here, before he runs into him." She rushed for the door, saying, "Or he'll never forgive me." Roxanne ran through the house looking for Frank. Someone mentioned they thought he was in the living room. Running to the doorway, she called out his name. "Frank!" He was sitting on the couch. He looked up at her and smiled. From out of the corner of his eye, he saw someone enter from the opposite side of the room. He glanced over to see who it was, intending to direct his attention back toward Roxanne. But that was before he saw Kirk Bronson standing in the doorway. "What the hell are you doing here?" Frank leapt to his feet and rushed toward Kirk. Without any forethought, he grabbed Kirk and threw him against the wall. Jason's commanding voice bellowed out, "Not in my house." "Fine. Let's just take it outside, then." Frank dragged Kirk through the doorway leading out to the terrace. Desperately, Kirk tried to free himself, but Frank's rage was more powerful than Kirk's need to get away. Frank shoved his fist into Kirk's face. Each time he hit the guy, he released bits of the hatred and anger he'd built up toward him over the years. Frank latched onto Kirk's hair and yanked his head down, kneeing him in the face. Kirk slumped to the ground, leaving Frank standing over him with handfuls of his hair. His archenemy was lying before him, nearly lifeless, but Frank was still full of rage. Opportunities like this didn't come along every day. Frank pounced down on him. "You stay away from my wife." He bashed Kirk's head against the ground. "You got that?" At first, Rich had hesitated to break up the fight. He wanted to give Frank a chance to let out some of his frustration. Besides, the way Rich saw it, Bronson had it coming. But now Rich was starting to get a little worried. "Frank!" He grabbed at his arm, trying half-heartedly to pull him off Kirk. "That's enough," he said, almost laughing. "Get off him." "Get away." Frank gave Rich a one-handed shove. "You gotta get off him." Grit invaded Rich's tone as he climbed onto his friend's back and locked his arms around Frank's. Rich, who was much smaller than Frank, had to yank at him with all his might. It took a couple of tries, but finally, Rich pulled Frank off of Kirk. Frank fought to break free, but Rich had him successfully locked down. It was taking everything Rich had to hold on to him. "Let me go." Frank tried to jerk away. "Sorry, pal." Rich held tight. "I can't do that." "Damn you, Rich!" Frank relaxed for a moment to build up strength for another go at breaking free. "If I let you go..." Rich reinforced his grip. Frank was not the type to give up this easily. "You're going to kill the guy." "Exactly." Frank tried breaking free again, and failed. Jerry and Jason appeared in the doorway. "I don't know how long you think I can hold him," Rich said. "You'd better get this guy out of here." They rustled Kirk away, but Rich was reluctant to release Frank. He was so pissed off he'd probably go hunt down the guy. "You can let me go now," Frank said. "They took him away." "You promise to be a good boy?" "No." Frank looked ready to explode. "First, I'm gonna get you for turning on me. Then I'm gonna go find that son of a bitch and kill him." "Daddy?" Frankie's trembling voice echoed across the yard. Frank looked up and saw his son standing in the doorway beside Roxanne. "What are you and Uncle Rich doing?" Frankie asked fearfully. Instantly, Frank relaxed. "We're just playing around," Frank assured him. "Right, Rich?" "Right," Rich said and released Frank. They both sat up and shook off what had just happened. Frank waved Frankie over. "You got a hug for your old man?" He chuckled. "Uncle Rich got the best of me." Frankie ran to his side, while Rich hopped up and went to Roxanne. Rich smiled, glad to finally see her. "Roxy, I'm happy to see that you're okay. Except for the memory thing." "Thank you." Her tone was friendly, but she looked uncomfortable. "Are you Candy's husband?" "Yes. I'm Rich." "Are you all right?" Roxanne asked anxiously. "Candy would never forgive me if anything happened to you." "I know he's your guest," Rich said of Kirk. "But it's probably in his best interest if he leaves here before Frank has the chance to find him." "You're right," Roxanne agreed. "Maybe it's none of my business," Rich said. "But if you don't want this marriage anymore, then end it. But don't start another relationship until you've finished this one." He was right. It wasn't any of his business. but Roxanne had to admit that he did have a point. Even so, the thought of ending her relationship with Frank brought on a sadness she couldn't explain. As afraid of Frank as she was, the thought of never seeing him again frightened her even more. Kirk entered the library just as Frank turned the corner at the other end of the hallway. Frank paused outside the door to find out what was going on inside the room before he went inside and finished the job he'd started earlier. "Kirk, I'm very sorry about what happened." Roxanne's voice flowed out into the hallway. "I really had no idea." To think she was consoling Kirk made Frank's blood boil. "It's okay," Kirk said. "Let me finish." Her tone grew stern. "I'm going to ask you, for me, for my sake, please don't press charges against Frank." "If you think it will help," he said. "You're trying to end it easily." "I'm not trying to end it at all." "How can you stand there and tell me you want him when you can't even remember him?" "I'm his wife," she said, "and I can't overlook that or throw it aside." "You're going back to him, aren't you?" Kirk said, and it was no question. "I have to find out if the feelings I had for him will resurface." Frank smiled and turned away, heading back down the hallway in the direction he'd come from. Everything was going to be okay. Kirk couldn't replace him in the past, and he wasn't going to replace him now. Frank was feeling pretty confident, until Jerry summoned him and Roxanne into the library a little while later. "I'm not going to get involved in your relationship, or tell you what I think you should do now that Roxanne has no memory of you, Frank, or your marriage," Jerry said. "But I will give you some advice. You have a long road ahead of you." He looked at Frank. "And no matter what you've seen in the movies, it's highly unlikely that Roxanne will ever regain the memory of those years she's lost." "How can you be so sure?" Frank asked. "Amnesia victims will usually regain their memory within a few weeks, a month at the most. After that, the chance of recovery diminishes with each passing day. Eventually you hit 0. "I hit 0 a long time ago." Roxanne sounded like she'd gotten used to the idea. "So what happens now?" Frank wondered out loud. "Your job is relatively simple," Jerry said. "Maybe not easy, but it is simple. All you have to do, Frank, is win Roxanne's heart again." Jerry turned to Roxanne. "And you, Roxanne, all you have to do is put your fear aside and open your heart to the possibility that you can love Frank again." Jerry paused, giving them a moment. "Now what you two need to decide is that what you both really want?" He eyed the two of them, long and hard. "So I think you two should think things over and make it a point to get together later tonight or tomorrow and discuss your thoughts and feelings on where you'll go from here." Roxanne went in search of Candy and discovered that Candy and Rich were staying in the bedroom across the hall from her own suite. She tapped on the door 3 times. "It's open," she heard Candy say from within. Roxanne opened the door, hoping Candy was alone. Finding out she was right made her feel a lot better. It wasn't long before both women were sitting on the bed, laughing and sharing secrets. "You'll have to help me," Roxanne said on a more serious note. "I'll help you in any way I can," Candy said. "I have no memories of Frank, so you have to share yours with me." "I'll share with you all that I have, but there are some memories you're going to have to go to him for." "How did we end up in Florida? Was that our plan when we left Tennessee?" "Well, no," Candy said. "We just got in your van, and when we got on the freeway you headed south and we never even discussed it." Candy sucked in a breath. "We stopped in Savannah for a couple of nights, but we both quickly decided to keep going. Then we ended up in Tampa." She gave Roxanne a bittersweet smile. "When you met Frank the first night we were there, I had a feeling we wouldn't be leaving." "I guess I was really taken with him, huh?" she asked, shyly. But what she really wanted to know was if she was as taken with him then as she was now. You definitely had the hots for him, that's for sure. Candy laughed softly. Roxanne looked away bashfully, and Candy added, It didn't take long for him to sweep you off your feet. Roxanne's curious eyes darted back to Candy. Was Frank the reason I wanted to stay in Tampa? Candy thought about it for a long time before she finally said, Yes. This is all so confusing. Roxanne didn't hide her frustration. I just wish I could remember something. Anything. Okay, Rocky. Candy reached out for her. Calm down. Everything's okay. We'll all help you with anything you need to know. Frank, me, Rich, and even Frankie. You guys can try to help me all you want, she said hopelessly. But I'll still just screw everything up. What are you talking about? Candy asked, confused. I've screwed everything up already, Roxanne said. My family comes here to see me, and who does my husband find when he gets here? She didn't wait for Candy's reply. His arch-enemy, that's who. Speaking of Kirk, a hint of restraint entered Candy's tone. How is it that he happened to be here anyway? He came upon me down on the beach a few days ago. He knew me, but I didn't have a clue who he was. Roxanne shrugged. So I brought him up to the house, and Jason and Jerry clearly knew him. Then it came out in the conversation that Kirk was with me when I had Frankie. So I thought he was my friend. And nobody told you the rest, huh? Nobody told me about Kirk's public claim to be Frankie's father, or that Frank had believed it for several years. She stopped, caught her breath, and shook her head. Candy, if I'd known what Kirk's being here would do to Frank, I would have asked him to leave before you guys got here. You need to be telling that to Frank, not me. That's true. Roxanne. Candy chose her words carefully. Frank loves you more than anything, but he's very vulnerable right now. I'm not sure I follow you. Rocky, you know that I'd never lie or mislead you, don't you? Roxanne nodded. You've got that same look in your eyes, the one you had when you first met Frank. Candy wore a frightened look, like she was walking down some dark, hostile alley. But Frank is in a different place than you. He's spent the last 8 months living with the fear that each day would be the day when Jerry would tell us you died. Candy's words were solemn and true. And while you can't recall a single thing about your time with him, he's been reliving every one of those memories over and over again, and beating himself up for the mistakes he made with you. What if he decides I'm not worth the trouble again? Roxanne asked weakly. I don't really see that happening. Candy laughed softly. My point is, Frank needs a little encouragement. Encouragement? All I'm saying is, you don't need to hide your feelings from him. Frank's not going to reject you. She looked at Roxanne with that look of hers, the one that said she was right and she knew it. But he's had enough to spare lately, and if you want to pursue your feelings for him, it would be nice if you'd let him know that. You really think I should tell him that I'm attracted to him? Roxanne wasn't so sure that was a great idea. Yes, Candy said as if her patience had worn way past thin. Let him know he's not alone. Let him know he's not alone. Huh. All Roxanne knew for sure was that she couldn't wait to see him again. After acknowledging that, she guessed she had to admit that he wasn't alone after all. Chapter 34. Frank hadn't shown up by the time dinner was served later that afternoon. His absence left Roxanne feeling antsy during the entire meal. She'd expected him to be there, and when he didn't show up, she was disheartened. After dinner, she searched the entire house and still couldn't find him anywhere. Determined, she went out back to search the grounds. The sun, not far from disappearing behind the horizon, barely lit the little path behind the house that led to the far end of the property. Luckily, Roxanne knew it well. There was a little garden alcove hidden at the end of the trail amid trees, shrubbery, and flowers. She tried to contain her relief when she saw him sitting alone on the bench in the little garden. "Excuse me." She went around to the front of the bench and faced him. "I hope I'm not disturbing you."
"Of course you're not disturbing me."
He smiled softly and reached for her hand.
"Come sit with me."
He saw the wedding rings on her finger.
"You're wearing your rings."
That puzzled him and delighted him all at the same time. "They were there when I woke up," she said, looking at her hand. "I just couldn't bring myself to take them off." She paused, recalling how, over the last few months, she'd tried several times to remove the rings, but she just couldn't do it. "I really need to tell you that I'm sorry." She sat down beside him. "I had no idea that his being here would bother you so much."
"You don't need to apologize to me."
"Yes, I do," she said. "If I'd known, I never would have." Her voice trailed off and she looked away.
"Roxy."
Frank brushed her hair back from her face.
"It's not necessary."
"Yes, it is," she said more forcefully, turning back to look at him. "Frankie, I really need to tell you I'm sorry. And I really need you to forgive me."
"Roxy, I would forgive you anything."
He paused, smiling sadly.
"You know, Candy once told me that if I was ever lucky enough to have you standing before me again, I should swallow my pride and do my best to convince you that I do love you."
"After everything I've done to you, and after all that's happened, you can still love me?"
A part of her wanted that to be true. "Yes. We both made a lot of mistakes. But the mistakes you made were not malicious or spiteful toward me." He looked at her with pleading eyes. "I know now that whatever you did back then, none of it was ever meant to hurt me."
"I need you to help me. I need you to share with me your memories of us."
"Well," he grinned impishly, "my memories may be rather one-sided."
"That's a chance I'm willing to take."
"Then I will try to be as objective as I possibly can."
"Tell me about when we met," she asked. "And not some summarized version either. I want to know everything that happened and don't leave out a single detail."
"Okay."
Frank laid his arm on the back of the bench. His hand barely touched her arm, but still, chills rushed through her.
"Let's see. It was a Saturday night, and the band wasn't playing," he said of Garrett Hollander. "I was out by myself at this club called The Other Place. It was pretty crowded, but it didn't take me long to single you out. I watched you for a while before you spotted me. Candy spent most of her time on the dance floor, and every so often she'd come over and chat with you briefly."
He smiled, recalling the evening in detail.
"After a while, you caught me watching you. And I've got to tell you, when we first looked at each other, something happened."
He paused, as if trying to figure it out.
"From that moment on, I've never been able to look at another woman without wanting and wishing for you."
Frank had finally confessed something he'd never admitted to anyone, except maybe through his music. "That's very flattering." She turned a vivid scarlet color around her cheeks.
"And true." He sighed heavily. "You looked away shyly. Before too long, Candy was at your side again. So I took the opportunity to move to a different place in the bar undetected. When she went back to the dance floor, you looked back over to where I'd been standing. When you saw I wasn't there, disappointment spread over your face. And that's when I knew."
"That's when you knew what?" she asked cautiously.
"That you and I were on the same page," he said. "That's all the encouragement I needed."
Roxanne remembered what Candy had said about giving him encouragement. "If you'd seen inside the dining room this evening, you would have most likely seen that same look of disappointment on my face."
"Really?"
Frank asked, hopeful. Yes. She was too embarrassed to look at him. I was hoping to see you at dinner, and I was disappointed when you didn't show up. I'm sorry. He found himself apologizing. I wasn't avoiding you. I just needed some time to think things through. He shook his head. Believe me, it's a scary feeling when the one you love doesn't know who you are. I wish I could remember you. I wish I could remember us. Surely there must have been some love at some point. They did, after all, conceive a son. If you're willing, he said, we can always make new memories. I'm very open to that idea. She smiled shyly, unable to tear her gaze away. Normally, I couldn't admit this to you, but with things the way they are, I'll tell you that I'm very attracted to you, and I find the thought of never seeing you again a little disturbing. Well then, do you think we should take the time to see if our marriage can survive? He asked with a measure of hope. I mean, we could start all over again. If you give me a chance, I'll make you fall for me. If you play your cards right, she said suggestively. That might not take much effort at all. That's what I'm counting on. He flashed her a genuinely happy smile. But you still have to share your memories with me. I want to know what made me fall for you in the first place. I can only give you my view of that. That's all I'm asking for. You're the only one who can show me what we shared. She stared with longing at him. What was it? What attracted you to me? Have you looked in a mirror? He asked offhandedly. I'll admit the initial attraction was purely physical. He let out a little chuckle. But I guess the attraction was so strong that I kind of became obsessed with possessing you. He stopped abruptly and cut his eyes to look at her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to that first night. Yes, let's. Well, like I've already said, something happened to me that night. You were different from all the other girls I'd ever known. How so? Well, he paused, as if thinking about it. I was used to women going the extra mile to throw themselves at me, and there you were, so shy and reserved. A haunted smile crossed his face. You didn't know I was in a band until I told you. But it was clear beforehand. You liked me, not the guy who got up on stage and sang a pretty song. You claimed my heart, and I was never able to offer any part of it to another soul. Until I met Frankie. Roxanne looked away. Do I really deserve to be loved so much? The misery of not being able to remember haunted her. You've never done anything to not deserve it. I hid your son from you, she reminded him. And worse yet, I let someone else publicly claim to be his father, she added with a measure of self-condemnation in her tone. It really wasn't as hateful as it sounds. You're awfully forgiving. How did we ever part? My crime is not seeing then what I see now. Well, maybe this time we'll both learn from our mistakes, she said, hopeful. I know I have. Candy says you're the reason I wanted to stay in Tampa all those years ago. Oh, God. He sighed, remembering the anguish he'd felt when he learned she was only visiting the city. When you told me you didn't live in Tampa, I thought I was gonna die. He laughed at himself. I took a big chance in not pursuing you too heavily that night. What do you mean? Well, I think we could have slept together that night if I'd pressed the matter, he speculated. But there was also a chance I could have scared you away. So in the end, I just let you know I really wanted to see you again, and asked you to call me, even if it was only to say goodbye. So I called? She asked, enjoying the story. Not for about 2 weeks, he snorted. That was the worst 2 weeks of my life. I spent the entire time replaying every second of the night we met, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. 2 weeks? Roxanne didn't understand her own actions. Why did I wait so long? She asked no one in particular. I think it probably had something to do with the fact that you were looking for a place to live. You bought a condo and settled in during that time. Well, thank God you didn't blow me off, she gasped, feeling a shiver of panic. Especially after I waited so long to call you. Frank could only laugh at the absurdity of that idea. He could have sooner stopped breathing than blow her off. You and I were inseparable from that day on. It sounds like we were really happy. We were. Frank's gaze traveled over Roxanne. She looked tired. It's getting late. Do you want to go in? I am a little tired, she said reluctantly. Maybe we should call it a night? She drew a breath. This won't end here. Tonight? Will it? It'll never end, he said with certainty. Not even your lapse of memory can stop it. Don't you see? You and I, we were meant to be. Frank knew it was true because he'd seen it in her eyes. That same look from such a long time ago. Finally, the look of fear was gone. It had been replaced with the look of love. Frank walked Roxanne to her bedroom door. I cannot begin to tell you how happy I am to have you standing here before me, he said. Thank you, she smiled. As it turns out, it hasn't been nearly as scary as I'd imagined. You have nothing to fear from me. Do you think we should take Frankie home tomorrow? I mean, it would probably be better for him if we all went home, don't you think? Nerves had her rambling. I know we have some things to work on, but we can do that just as easily at home, right? Yes, he nodded. It would probably be better for all of us if we just went home. Shall I make the arrangements first thing in the morning? Yes. Let's go home. Frank couldn't believe his luck. After everything he'd done to her, she still wanted to go home with him. She couldn't remember the things that had happened between them, but she wanted to go home, mainly because she figured that's where she was supposed to be. Frank couldn't agree more. The next day, the entire party, including Jason and Jerry, headed back to Tampa. But Jerry wasn't quite ready to turn Roxanne over to Frank Garrett. Not totally. Not yet. Sure, Candy believed Frank's intentions were honorable, but Jerry wanted proof. Even though neither Frank nor Candy had exactly jumped up and down to welcome Jason and Jerry to accompany the family back home, they went anyway. Once back home in Tampa, Roxanne breathed a sigh of relief after learning that Candy and Rich lived next door. It made her rest a little easier knowing Candy was so close. Frank moved his things out of their bedroom and into Candy's old room. He knew it was better for the both of them if he gave her the time and the privacy she needed. Just like before, he needed to give her the opportunity to fall in love with him before he attempted to sleep with her. It didn't take Roxanne long to realize they'd returned home a few days before Thanksgiving. Right away, she wanted to talk to Frank about the dinner. Surprisingly, she found him in her study. A puzzled look crossed her face over finding him at what was supposed to be her desk. What's wrong? Quickly, he got up and moved around to the front of the desk. Are you okay? Is there anything I can get you? Do you write too? Roxanne asked curiously. No, he chuckled. Well, songs. I write songs. I used to, anyway. And you don't anymore? She sat down on the edge of the desk. No. He leaned against the desk and crossed his arms over his chest. Why not? Because I can't. You can't, she asked. Or you won't. Both, he said. See, Roxy, I figured out that it was the music that destroyed you. You felt like I chose music over you. I won't let that happen again. He shrugged and shook his head. This time I won't make the same mistake. Thanksgiving is in a few days. She wanted to change the subject for now. Do you want to have a dinner? Yes, I'd like that. We can invite Candy and Rich. She paused, gathering the nerve to discuss Garrett Hollander. Where's the rest of the band? Do you want to invite them? That's not necessary, he said shortly.
But aren't they your friends? Why would you exclude them from the day?
I don't want to put too much on you. He easily explained it away. Although, a cynical inner voice cut through his thoughts. Glenna's probably anxious to see for herself that you're okay.
Glenna?
Roxanne had no recollection of Glenna. She's married to Glenn. He's the band's drummer. And you and Glenna were pretty good friends. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable talking about his former colleagues. I think the rest of the guys are probably in Europe.
Well, we have to invite Glenn and Glenna.
Okay. Frank willingly agreed. He was prepared to do whatever it took to make Roxanne happy. Of course, he knew he couldn't give her what she really wanted. Her memories. Or her ability to retain information about the past. He'd lost count of how many times they'd talked about Glenn, Glenna, and the rest of the band. But even the idea of what she'd lost was fleeting, and she had a hard time retaining the facts within the recesses of her mind. Jerry had warned him that her ability to hold on to the information about her lost years would be a constant and repetitious learning experience. After a week of repetitious learning about her connection with Glenna, Roxanne decided she owed her old friend an apology. A big one. She planned to do just that on Thanksgiving Day. Finally, the day came, and Roxanne quickly pulled Glenna aside.
Can I talk to you?
Roxy, you don't know how happy I am to see you. Glenna followed Roxanne into the room that housed her piano.
I wish I remembered you.
A cold knot formed in Roxanne's stomach. Sometimes she felt like everybody was keeping secrets behind her back, even though no one had done anything to warrant such feelings. Nothing sparks for you, huh?
No.
Exasperation washed over Roxanne.
And it's not likely that anything ever will.
It wasn't the question she was growing tired of, so much as having no means to rectify the problem.
But that's not why I wanted to talk to you, she said, getting back on track. I need to apologize to you.
Apologize to me? Whatever for? Glenna asked, almost laughing. You don't even remember me.
True, but I still know what I did to you.
Roxanne sucked in a breath and swallowed her pride.
I lied to you. I told you something that was entirely untrue. In the process, I made a lot of people mad at you. And for that, I'm truly sorry.
Yes, she nodded. But I chose to believe your lie, when deep down inside I knew it couldn't possibly be true. And besides, you've already apologized for that, and I've already accepted. So there's really no need for any more apologies. Later that evening, after the sun had long since disappeared, their friends had gone home and Frankie was tucked safely in bed, Roxanne and Frank lounged lazily out by the pool in a double lawn chair.
Today was a good day, don't you think?
It was more of a statement than a question for Roxanne. Yes, I think it went very well. You know I'm going to grill you some more, don't you? Grill away, he coaxed her. I'll tell you anything you want to know.
Well,
she hesitated, a little embarrassed.
I'm going to get a little personal here.
Okay, he said cautiously.
I want to know about the first time you and I had sex.
We did not have sex, he corrected her. It was so much more than that.
Really?
Frankly, she was astonished to hear a man say that.
Well, enlighten me then,
she said in a half-teasing way. I guess you want every little detail, too.
Each and every one.
Well, it was the 4th of July, and that was the day I told you I was in love with you.
So, I suppose I said I loved you too?
Yes. A smile turned up one corner of his mouth. As a matter of fact, you did. That was also the day you told me about Chuck.
Why did I wait so long to tell you about him? What is it with me and not being forthcoming with information?
The whole notion troubled her. Roxanne, if you want me to keep telling you about the things that happened between us, you're going to have to stop condemning yourself for the things you did back then.
I'm sorry.
Her apology was riddled with her frustration.
I just don't understand how I could do the things I did to you. Jesus, I was supposed to love you.
You did love me, he said.
I really don't mean to upset you. I'll try not to do it again.
Roxy, he started to object. I don't want you to be afraid of upsetting me. You're not upsetting me. I just hate to see you condemning yourself when there's really no reason.
With all this reminiscing that you're doing for my benefit, she dragged out the inquiry, what if you begin to see what a jerk I really was, and decide it's not worth the effort a second time?
You weren't a jerk. His voice was soothing. I didn't think so then, and I'm not going to think so now. And as for the effort, I'd put forth the effort 100 times over, if it meant there was even the slightest possibility that you could fall in love with me again.
Roxanne looked at him. Do you believe in love at first sight?
She was beginning to.
I just don't want to find myself in love with you, only to find out that you don't love me anymore.
Baby, that will never happen, he said. I tried for a lot of years to stop loving you. But no matter how hard I tried to tell myself I was over you, when all was said and done, it just wasn't true. The problem back then was that I didn't realize it until it was too late. But I won't make that mistake again.
You sound so certain of that.
I spent 8 months thinking I'd lost you forever. I'll never let anything so trivial as my pride come between us again. A sad, out-of-touch sensation filled Roxanne's heart. She wished she could remember something. Anything.
Please, go on with your story. I want to know about the night we were first together.
Well, he said softly, you were a bit apprehensive because you thought I had this great experience advantage over you. But I quickly put those fears to rest, he added, bragging. And how, pray tell, did you accomplish that? I have my ways. His laughter teased her. I am a man of many talents, you know.
And what exactly was it that you used that time?
She teased him right back. Well, I basically told you it was a journey that only you and I could take together. Essentially, it didn't really matter what I'd done in the past, because what you and I shared would be something I could never have with any other woman.
It's no wonder that I fell for you, she sighed. Well, I've discovered one of your so-called many talents.
And what do you think you've learned?
You're a silver-tongued devil, that's what.
She laughed. Nah, he said. I'm just a man in love, that's all. He looked away. While he was a man in love, he was also there alone.
I'll let you in on a little secret.
She felt as giddy as a teenager.
Well, I've only known you for the better part of a week, that I can remember anyway. I want to be in love with you.
Frank told her about that first night from such a long time ago, about the bubble bath, the champagne, and how Candy had barged in on them. He also told her how he'd promised her a bottle of Dom Perignon someday.
And did you ever make good on that promise?
Regrettably, he had to answer. No, I didn't.
You are a man of your word, she asked. Are you not?
That I am.
Then when you least expect it, I'll let you know that it's time to make good on your promise.